My name is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm a professor in environmental studies here at Dartmouth and the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And today I'm really excited to be hosting in a new energy series, which is us at Dartmouth, but also a bunch of other universities, a talk with Debbie Seligsohn from Villanova University on reframing US-China climate relations. Competition is the key to climate mitigation. This is an idea of hers. Debbie recently received her PhD from UC San Diego in political science, but I think the new energy series is focused on early career researchers. And as an academic, Debbie is early career, but I just want to highlight that she's had a long career before becoming an academic. And her time at the State Department, where she served in China and India and Nepal and New Zealand on energy and environmental issues, and also her time working in the nonprofit sector at World Resources Institute and others. Debbie brings a wealth of experience to the academic bench, and the perspectives that she will bring to bear in the conversation today will, I'm sure, be of interest to all of us here in the conversation. I welcome and invite you to put your questions in the Q&A box as we go forward. And as I have mentioned before, this series is part of a host of universities. If you can switch to the next slide, please, Stephanie. Who are part of this consortium, just sharing the work of young scholars all over the world. So I'm going to mute myself. Debbie's going to speak for a little while and turn off my camera. And then please feel free to again use that Q&A box, and I'll come back and we'll have a conversation incorporating your questions and inputs as well. Thank you, everybody. We're really happy that you're here.
Good morning, everybody. I'm not going to speak with slides today because what I really want to talk about is an idea rather than a set of numbers. But the basic truth that we're starting with is that both the United States and China are critical for any solution to climate change, any serious mitigation in the world. I think everybody in this audience knows the damage that climate change is causing. We also are seeing day in, day out new reports that some of the worst scenarios are in terms of the rate of climate change are coming to pass. So we all know that the issue is serious and urgent, and I don't think I really need to go into that. At this point, China is 28% of global emissions as of 2019 numbers. The US was about 15%. A decade ago, the US and China had about the same share of global emissions. So the US has come down in terms of total percentage, but remember, we're only 5% of the world's population. So we're still emitting above our weight. And other countries are considerably behind. The entire European Union now accounts for only 7.7% of global emissions. India is almost 7% at this point. So it really is up to the US and China to do the largest share of mitigation. And we now have an administration that has put climate front and center, that really does have more climate policy than any previous administration, and certainly highlighted it during the campaign more than we've ever seen before. So the question becomes, how is it that we're going to get the US and China on the same page and both addressing climate change? And I think typically the minute you raise that question, the obvious answer that everybody goes to is cooperation. We need more cooperation. And I think cooperation can give us quite a great deal. But what I want to discuss with you today is there are limits to thinking in terms of a cooperation frame, both in terms of what it gives us and in terms of the state of US-China relations. And so I think we have to think more creatively, recognize the fact that we are in a period of intense competition, and think about how we can harness that competition for good, how we can harness that competition to actually drive better mitigation outcomes. So firstly, what can cooperation give us? Clearly, cooperation is good for producing climate science. an enormous amount of the work that goes into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change involves joint work between US and Chinese scientists, social scientists. There's an enormous amount of cooperative research going on. There could be more, we could fund it more. This is clearly an area where governments can help and promote it, and limiting science to borders is clearly not a good idea. And of course, that's an area where keeping an eye on the US government and making sure that it doesn't put up false limits to collaboration in science is going to be really important, because so much climate research goes on in both countries, and we really need that information to flow. The other area where cooperation can be very, very helpful is in thinking about effective policies and studying each other's policies and mutual learning. And in both of these areas, a lot of this has gone on even during the Trump years, but with less federal money than in the past. So more federal money would certainly be helpful. Both countries face a significant transition from fossil fuel to new fuels if we're going to get to serious mitigation. And so looking at experiences with just transition, how to do the transition and help people are going to be really important, even though there's so many differences between our two countries that we're not likely to discover that we have the same solutions. But certainly being able to look at directions and share insight is going to be really important. And there are a lot of concrete measures, many of which are outlined in the executive orders that President Biden outlined today, on things like addressing emissions from abandoned infrastructure or looking at brownfields. These are the kinds of issues that both countries face. There are a lot of technical solutions to these. And again, we can share more than we have been sharing, especially over the last 4 years. But we can also look at the state and local cooperation that has been going on even in the past 4 years. Angel Shu and I wrote a paper looking at how to use state and local cooperation as a basis for whatever cooperation we want to do in the future, and to build on it rather than to try to reimagine things at the federal level. All of this, I think, is really good, and it really needs to be done, and it will really help. But I don't think that this alone is going to give us large-scale commercial development. And we certainly didn't see that in past cooperative efforts, whether it was during the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the Obama administration. And so I think we need to think beyond renewing a bunch of cooperative protocols to what's going to drive big development of renewable energy and shifts away from fossil fuels, massive improvements in efficiency, all the things we know we need, rethinking urban planning, everything we need to actually get to the levels of mitigation that our planet is clearly crying out for. So that's why I think we have to move beyond the cooperation frame. The second reason we need to move beyond the cooperation frame is where we're at in US-China relations. So let's step back for a minute and think about the relationship as a whole. Frankly, it's not very good right now. And that's not likely to change in a massive way. I think it will become more professional over the next couple of years. But the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has indicated that he certainly sees China as a major problem, a major competitor that the US has a great number of issues with. And so I don't think that we're going to suddenly see relations snap back. And I think we have to think about what it was we would be thinking about them snapping back to. So we have these huge trade problems. President Trump highlighted them. I don't think his policies address them that effectively, but he was talking about a series of problems that really started back in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. And you see this massive increase in exports from China and what's become known as the China shock, of this real change in manufacturing in specific localities in the US that led to a lot of political changes that John Cook, Jack Zhang, and I have documented, and many others as well, that stems from the work of O'Toole, Dorn, and Hansen on the economics of the China shock. So you had this growing sort of problem that really started at the grassroots with an issue of resentment toward China, and eventually led to major change at the federal level in terms of views of trade. I think there's going to be an effort to have a more WTO compliant, more constructive approach to trade disputes, but trade disputes are not going anywhere. At the same time, we also had real changes domestically in China that started to make it more difficult for US policy going back to 2012. So this really started within the Obama administration. And frankly, I think a lot of the Chinese problems with US policy really began because they didn't address them then and left them to simmer until President Trump responded in much less sort of measured ways. But Xi Jinping came in 2012, is much more controlling domestically, much more assertive internationally. Human rights problems throughout China's border areas, from Xinjiang to Mongolia to Hong Kong, have increased dramatically. The whole idea of one country, two systems in Hong Kong seems to be something that Xi Jinping is pushing back on in a huge, huge way. And so I think the political context in which the US deals with China is just fundamentally different from, say, back in 2009, when we were thinking about how we were going to cooperate more on China climate change. And of course, that was pretty challenging too. So it's not like the status quo ante was easy, but it was always presented in this frame. And the other part of that frame, it was always presented that climate change was going to be the area where we could make nice so that we could get something in one of these other areas. The thing is, climate change is way too urgent for that. We actually need progress on climate change. We can't use it simply as some friendly salve to sort of bind the wounds from other areas where we're having more competition. We have to figure out how to solve climate change. So the overall relationships was made more challenging by Xi Jinping. It also has been made more challenging by the declining US image in the world. The sort of basic respect for the way the US does things has certainly declined, I would guess everywhere, but certainly in China. And this really started with the 2008 financial crisis. I remember I used to go, when I worked for World Resources Institute, to the China Development Forum every year, which is a big conclave of the world's top economists, plus all kinds of business leaders who pay a lot of money to go, hosted by the key advisors to the State Council, which is like the Chinese cabinet. So it's kind of this big deal for business leaders to hobnob with huge government important people, and for economists, originally conceived of as international economists, come and advise the Chinese on how to run their economy better. And what happened starting in 2009 was Chinese economists were pushing back and saying, wait a minute, our economy is actually doing better than your economy. Maybe we actually know something that you don't know, or we're better able to implement things, and maybe this isn't such a one-way street. And China's recovery from the 2009 2008 financial crisis was the most rapid in the world and worth taking seriously. It really did change people's confidence. And of course, that happened at the same time as the Chinese hosted a spectacular Olympic Games. There was a lot else going on, all of which led to more confidence in China, and in China, less confidence in the United States. And this has only been exacerbated over the ensuing years, right? We have had this president who says one thing about China one day and another thing the next day, which does not lead to an enormous amount of respect. And then we have the COVID crisis, because yes, the Chinese had some trouble responding at first, but they have now controlled the disease to such an extent that the total number of cases in China is a quarter of what the total number of deaths in the United States are to date. Now, probably it's more like equal, because all countries are underestimating their total number of cases by probably a factor of 4, because you miss asymptomatic cases, you miss a lot of early cases, and you also just miss people who get sick and never go get tested and don't wind up needing hospitalization. So everybody's numbers are low, but the point is we are now doing so much worse than they are. You know, we're a quarter of the world's deaths and only 5% of the world's population. The result is the US image in the world could not be at a worse point than it is right now. And that really does affect the relationship heading forward. So we have an enormous number of challenges. And, you know, the new administration is coming in with strong language on Chinese human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. We can expect that to continue. So we can expect a more professional relationship, but we can't expect a super friendly relationship. So that's the big context in which we're in, where there are limitations to what cooperation can offer us at all. And there's also real limitations to how sort of happy, friendly the relationship is going to be at this point in time. So let's reframe the situation and think about a different model. And what I would suggest is going back to an idea that people were tossing around maybe 15 years ago, but in a somewhat different context, which is thinking of the World Trade Organization as a model for how we want to think about international cooperation. And what I would call the World Trade Organization model is rules-based competition, right? We set a series of rules, not so that we work together, but so that we can actually compete economically with one another. Hopefully it's our companies competing with one another rather than some nation state mercantilist thing. But basically it's rules for competition, not rules for cooperation. And this is different than thinking about WTO as an enforcement mechanism for climate change. That's been a popular discussion from time to time, the border tax adjustment type of argument that we should punish countries for failing to do things. I have always thought that was a rather odd discussion for the United States, because were that to be the norm, the EU should be slamming huge border taxes on US product. But it doesn't seem like it's an obvious choice for how to address either the US or China to address each other's climate emissions. But think about how we organize the international order in terms of a way that fosters competition on mitigation. How can we actually drive a competitive process where countries and companies are trying to produce the best technologies, the best approaches to actually reduce emissions? So one of the things to think about in that context is that US and China action to date has not really been as dependent on what the other is doing as sometimes appears to be the case when we discuss it in the international context. So right before Copenhagen in 2009, the US and China back to back announced new commitments for greenhouse gas reductions. So it was a huge deal, especially the Chinese, who had never made an international commitment before. But neither of these commitments were based on new actions. Both of these commitments were based on what they already were doing domestically. It was basically simply saying internationally, this is what our policies to date will get us, and so we now commit to that internationally. You see a similar phenomenon in the 2014 agreement leading up to Paris. I mean, and let's face it, even in the US's nationally determined contribution under Paris, under Obama, which, you know, that we mostly met that commitment, even though President Trump announced he was leaving Paris, because what we were doing was adding up what we were already doing domestically. It wasn't that the international process was driving our domestic behavior. It was more that we were announcing to the globe what it was we were doing domestically. And I would argue that that's very much similar to what's going on in China. So in the US, what we're going to do now at the moment is very much limited by these executive orders. I think it's going to be really important that we somehow get beyond that to big infrastructure bills and whatever. Let's hope that's changeable. But our international posture right now is completely constrained by what we do domestically. I think Chinese action, you know, is already quite dramatic. They've announced this 2060 carbon neutrality target, which, you know, was announced while Trump was president. There was no US pressure leading to that, right? I think the things driving climate action are the same things I began listing when I joined WRI and started briefing Congress people in 2007. The first is air pollution mitigation. There are huge co-benefits to reducing dependence on fossil fuels for reducing air pollution. Air pollution has improved significantly in China, but continues to be a major concern. And so there's a lot of interest in anything that can drive co-benefits. Huge concern about climate risk. China worries more than anything about, the Chinese government worries about how it can feed its people. They worry about agricultural stability. They worry about their coastal areas. They worry about the ever increasing risk of emerging diseases. There are just so many reasons that they would like to see the risks from climate mitigated. The third reason, which I think is becoming ever increasing in importance and is really the key to the future, is the opportunity of climate technologies, right? That the Chinese have really embraced the idea that these new technologies, renewable energy technologies, perhaps carbon capture technologies, are all going to be the way a huge industry grows in the future, and they want to be dominant in this space. That much more than we've seen in the US, there's been just an embrace that the way to be globally competitive and stay on top of things is to continue to move into new areas and to really encourage them. And that's why we've seen now for a decade mandates on electric vehicle usage and other things, because the Chinese want to drive these new technologies. But in trying to create these businesses, they do it often by creating the markets for these businesses, and therefore they create mitigation opportunities. And the fourth area is anyone you talk to in China will say that international pressure matters. But that international pressure at this point is much, much broader than the United States, right? We have this story of the EU in particular having had considerable success in mitigation. So that's been a constant driver. I do remember at Copenhagen when the British first told the Chinese that they expected that within the decade, China's emissions would outpace the UK's on a per capita basis, which they certainly have, and in fact, the entire EU at this point. And so there's a real, I believe that's true. Don't double check me on that. Sorry about that. But certainly they've outpaced the UK in a number of major EU countries. So they were shocked. They did not expect that. And that sort of where China fits, especially relative to developing world emissions, has an effect on China's actions within the broader international community. Because other developing countries, when they're concerned about climate risk, are looking more and more at Chinese emissions, but they haven't stopped looking at ours. So we need to think about how we can solve ours and they can't. So when I think about competition, that's what I'm thinking about. It's how we set up our international system to really encourage this drive toward the embracing of the sort of climate technology opportunity to really try to be world leaders as companies, as countries in building new and better and climate friendly energy systems, transportation systems, urban design, etc. I think the Chinese have already embraced that idea, even if the 2060 target and where they seem to be going in the next few years is a bit ambiguous. I think we need to look at the next 5-year plan, which will come out in March, to see what the real concrete short to medium term targets are, to see how rapidly they're heading toward it. But the idea that there's a market to be won, I think, is already well understood in China. If the US moves down the direction that President Biden has outlined of Build Back Better, I think that's where we're headed to. And that's really the big challenge in the United States is, do we have a forward-looking climate policy or a backward-looking climate policy? But once we set these goals, once we set global targets, what is going to drive this is domestic policy and the fostering of competition rather than some big cooperative effort to reduce climate change. And so I think if we frame this in terms of a competition that we can win and that we can really have our companies do very well in, and that we can encourage them by creating those markets at home for those companies, we will be much more successful, and we will also be much more successful at navigating the climate relationship within the very real constraints of a very difficult bilateral relationship. There've already been columns saying, oh, Secretary Kerry, and I don't know what his new title as climate advisor is other than secretary. So we'll say Secretary Kerry, is going to threaten everything else in the US-China relationship because he only cares about climate change, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't have the power to do that. But more importantly, I don't think there's something that we need to agree to that would be advanced by trading away some other interests the US has in some other sphere. But it is worth thinking about the fact that we have to be able to operate in different issue areas at the same time. And we have to acknowledge that the Chinese may be doing better in certain areas than in others, right? That we can acknowledge that the Chinese right now have a terrible human rights record, but they've done awfully well on pollution abatement in the last decade. Even within an issue area, we have to be able to acknowledge that after, for example, having a rocky start on COVID, they're now doing pretty well. And so on climate change, I think we need to acknowledge the parts that China is doing really right, including huge contributions on climate science, on climate technology, on a much greater ability to deploy new climate demo technologies at scale, while also saying they really need to do a lot more in terms of things like reducing all of the duplicative power plants that are coal-fired power plants that are running at half capacity right now. That's a really dirty way to run power plants, and they really need to think about sort of how to move to a post-coal future more rapidly. But so do we. And the drive in each country to actually do these things will be mostly domestic, and it will be mostly driven by companies that want to do these things. So what we need are rules of the game that encourage companies that really want to produce these next generation energy technologies, transportation technologies, better buildings, etc. And if we put it in this kind of competition frame, I think we can actually compete to a success that's beneficial for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. This was just fabulous. I knew when I invited you to be part of this series that we would have a talk that was thought-provoking, but also able to contextualize this relationship in a much broader framework than just carbon and climate goals. So thank you for that. You and I met back in, I think, 2009. You were telling me earlier that I was on crutches, which I think was 2009, in China. And at that time, you were still working at the U.S. Embassy as the energy. No, you had just finished. You're at World Resources Institute then, and your experience in China and having lived there for over a decade and raised your children there is one that has you gives you a unique perspective. And I remember being struck the years that I lived there, the very different conversations that were happening as to what the problems were about climate change from the Western audiences, and then the responses from the Chinese groups. And I'm just wondering, could you update us today and just share with us a little bit about how China is looking at climate change or their competitive advantage in this framework differently? And then we have a lot of really nice questions coming in. I see we also have some people like Vance Wagner in the audience who may be able to ask some good transportation questions to get us going there too. But please.
Well, I can't imagine a transportation question from Vance that he couldn't answer better himself. So he's one of the gurus on transportation and on many
Absolutely.
other things. But anyway, you know, what's been striking all along is that in general, Chinese have tended to have a more optimistic view about the role of technology and the ability to address issues than I think is just typical of late 20th century, early 21st century America. And this sort of pervades many different issue areas, that there's just this belief in this. And I actually, you know, in 2010, I took Al Gore's training in how to give the inconvenient truth lecture in Beijing with a group of like 300 Chinese taking this training. And for various reasons, Gore actually gave a full 8 hours of the training himself. And it was quite an extraordinary experience. And he's like so committed to it and had done so much work. And the level of thought about every single slide was fascinating. But the pushback from the Chinese audience over and over and over again was, let's talk about what we can do. Let's talk about the future. We all agree that this is a disaster. We don't need to convince our colleagues and our friends that it's a disaster. They all know it.
Yeah.
It's, you know, and I remember, you know, I went to Bali, I went to Copenhagen, and I'd be like chatting with the taxi driver on the way to the airport, and they'd be like, oh, you're going to do the climate negotiation. It was always a very positive, oh, this is a good thing for the world thing. And so I think that level of just optimism and let's just do something, which, I mean, I think that's part of the story of why the Chinese have been more effective on COVID as well. I mean, my friends in China are like, if we think masks would help, why aren't we all just wearing masks? And it's like, if there's a technical solution to a problem, why don't we just all use it? And that's very much a pervasive attitude. But I think, they also have an enormous coal industry and coal-fired power plant sector that likes building coal-fired power plants. And so that's always the push and the pull.
Well, and I think it's really important for our US audience to appreciate that our kind of fight about climate change is really unique. It wasn't happening in Europe, it wasn't happening in the rest of the world. That kind of uh, climate doubt that was funded is now a big part of the record, and that didn't take place in China. You mentioned technology as one of the real high points. And when we were there in 2009, we were working on CCS, carbon capture and sequestration together. How has that sector shifted from the Chinese perspective and in China?
Well, I mean, it's sort of humming along. I mean, they continue to do it. They haven't deployed as much as I think people thought back then that they would. But I do think if we get to the point where there is some kind of global agreement to really cut back on emissions, if we finally get to this is an emergency, we need to do this now, the Chinese are going to be the people poised to sell these systems all over the world, because they've been the ones working on this technology and they have it.
And then another technology question that came up was from Nicholas Irvin, and I think he said that China got their PV sector by making a market, and that happened through mandate. Can you tell us of any nuanced differences between how China can drive market through mandates and how US can? In particular, he sees that China required PV on top of many schools. Can the US require PV to cover school rooftops, or is that not politically possible? But there was another question that I think is that's a specific question, but there was another question a little bit earlier that was asking about the embeddedness of the two countries and how the production of technologies. On a note of competition, how do you deal with the economic interdependence of the two countries? Solar panel imports from China to lower cost. How do you reconcile the fact that production costs are often lower in China with the competition model you're proposing involve boosting domestic production in the US or continue imports where costs are minimized to maximize decarbonation? So the specific example of solar and then solar within the story of competition, what would that look like? With the
So
recognition that just school rooftops aren't going to get us to the full reductions we need.
yeah, so I think but I think the solar example is a really good one because it's actually more complicated than that, right? The Chinese market, the Chinese solar PV industry originally developed because of the incentives for solar in California, New Jersey, Germany, and then Spain. Those were the markets, and those were the markets because of specific policies. But when you look at things like the California solar industry, which has been studied to death, the reality was, even though the Chinese were producing this essentially commodity product, all of the fabrication of the full PV set to go on the roof and the installation and the maintenance were all done in California. And so it was actually, there were many more jobs generated in California than were generated at these high-tech factories in China. So the fact that these companies were integrated was actually a win for everybody. And when the US raised tariffs on the PV imports, it actually cost jobs in the US, because by raising the cost, it drove down the number of people actually in the industry. So I think there's that's where I think the WTO model is actually a good model, because the WTO model is about rules of competition. It doesn't say companies can't work with each other across borders, right? And it enables plenty of trade. So I think trade, but in my experience, this government to government fostering of company to company links just doesn't do very much compared to what companies do on their own if they're working within a world with clear rules that they can navigate. And so I think the cooperation frame just gets us only so far and is much better on science and policy, is really what I was trying to say. But then in terms of mandates, so what happened was after the Great Recession, most of the incentives in the Western world kind of disappeared on solar. And so the Chinese had this huge capacity that had really grown up organically without particularly much interest from the Chinese central government, or even Jiangsu province then realized most of these companies were in Jiangsu, so they got interested. And so you start with some local, provincial incentives for people to start using PV, and then you get government incentives. So there were incentives for building developers to use PV on their buildings. There were mandates for various kinds of buildings. There were all, I mean, and there were sort of incentives for setting up bigger PV power plants. And the main thing was that there were portfolio standards, right? That every Chinese power company had to have X percentage of their power from renewables. Those are the same thing we have in the US. We have renewable energy portfolio standards. So I think
at the state level,
at the state level,
Mhm.
but more than half the states have them. Unfortunately, they've been one of the things that sort of energy industry funded think tanks have been pushing back in Republican state legislatures. Because the thing is, Americans like those. Americans love renewable energy portfolio standards. If you survey Republicans, Democrats, everybody loves renewable energy. It's clean, it's nice. There's nobody with a negative feeling about solar, and very few people with a negative feeling about wind.
You haven't tried to cite a project in New England recently, but please continue.
Well, that's wind, and those are rich Democrats that cause the problem, right? So there are, look, I mean, and almost every problem with wind could be solved if we painted the things different colors, which, as a huge Alexander Calder fan, I really want to see happen. So anyway, I think windmills are beautiful. But be that as it may, so yes, any state could mandate that schools need solar on their rooftops. Any state could mandate pretty much anything in that regard, right? It's there are limits to what we can do at the federal level, but it's also the case that incentives worked really well in California and Germany and places like that. So we can do what we do, which is use incentives. We just have to do more of it. And this massive infrastructure rebuild is the way we can actually make step change.
So I really appreciate the changes in between thinking about the policy space being one where collaboration could happen, the science space being one where collaboration can happen, and the competition conversation is one that formalizes rules across businesses and in the industrial sector to allow for them to do what they do best. One of the observations that a lot have made about the WTO is people really like those rules when they work for them, but a lot less so when they don't. And we've seen that in a lot of kind of US responses. The rules were great when they were to our advantage, but once they became pinch points for our businesses, they were much less popular. And there were several questions here about implementing competition in practice. Claire Wayner's asking about, is this awards, recognition, penalties? Do you see a structure parallel to the WTO, or what kinds of ideas you have here in terms of establishing and ensuring that those rules are fair and observed?
So I guess I'm mostly thinking about mitigation targets. That what we want to talk about in the international space is what our targets are. You know, everybody is now coming out with these 2050, 2055, 2060 net zero targets, and we need to be talking concretely about what we're committing to in the era leading up to that, and giving essentially a clear path to business to be able to produce. Because I actually think ambitious targets lead directly to competition. You don't need some special rules to foster competition. It was our ambitious air quality standards in the 70s that led to catalytic converters and FGD and all of these pollution abatement technologies. If we make the standards clear, the competition will happen, business will happen, and it will come. So I think it's mostly, I think, about talking clearly in the international space about what our goals are. But those goals are then to let loose competition, not to imagine it's some kind of cooperative endeavor.
No, that's very helpful. You had before addressed the fact that there was a question that came up about climate denialism in China and that it really isn't a thing driving the political discussion. And I just wanted to put a pin in that one. But there was a question also from Vance, who greets us both. Hey, Vance, and asks about this excellent idea of competition as a new climate framing, but really wondering, how do you operationalize this while maintaining the healthy race to the top sense of mutual benefit, without letting it dissolve into a zero-sum or even worse, mutually harmful tariff argument, creation of two separate spheres, et cetera. The harmonization and the coordination is challenging enough within the US government, doing it across these rules as well.
Well, that's why it's sort of reminding people of the David Ricardo basis of world trade rather than the lawyer basis, right? I mean, competition is not zero sum. Competition actually leads to better outcomes, right? And I think it's worth reminding people that that's true in every sphere, right? So we can talk about scientific cooperation, but let's face it, scientists race each other to get their papers published first, to get their accolades, to be the discoverer, to win that Nobel Prize. Competition is very healthy for producing things that are beneficial to everyone, right? That the fact that the Chinese wanted to be able to sequence that COVID genome fast and publish it for the world led to the world having it, and all of these different vaccine makers racing to be the first to come out with vaccines, because there was a lot of money in that. So I think the zero sum, I tend to think that when we talk about cooperation, the zero sum problem is worse, because then there's this feeling of, oh, what are we giving away? And so I think if we talk about the fact that this is a race we can win, that we will actually be better off in terms of the domestic political discussion. Because let's face it, the domestic political discussion is already about how China is a competitor. China, I mean, I think that in terms of some of the geostrategic stuff, I think it's actually way overstated how much of a competitor China is. And I think there are ways we could actually come to some accommodations, recognizing that they aren't ever, ever going to be a small power again, right? I mean, we just have to deal with that. But I think every time we talk about cooperation, somebody's afraid we're giving away the store.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And one of the pieces that I really appreciated about this framing is that it does allow for a new way of thinking about that competition. But I also want to recognize how you did a very good job of saying, it wasn't good in this instance, but then you also have to look over here, and a much more nuanced way to think about China's response to COVID, or China's response to reducing pollution, for example, and understanding how that's changed over time, where it's good and also where it's not good. But I also recognize there's a couple questions, one here by Jonathan Winder. How can we have any confidence in China's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060 when they're still building coal-fired plants? How is carbon neutrality possible if China is willing to shut down coal as its power source? And another question about what does that even mean in terms of international cooperation, like the Belt and Road Initiative? So if you could help us understand what that is like, both domestically and also the international engagements in this space.
So on the coal-fired power plants in China, I think we have to keep in mind how much coal they're using, not just how many plants they have, because they run most of these plants at 50% capacity. So they're building way too many plants. And that definitely is something that everybody should keep an eye on, but the pressure to change that's going to come domestically. I don't think there's much the international community is going to do about that. The Chinese had a big moratorium in 2016. I would not be shocked if we don't see another one within the next 2 or 3 years. And so I think it's going to be a push and a pull over the next 5 to 7 years, but I think they will get beyond it. But there's a lot of fighting going on domestically on how to deal with it and how rapidly to shift, et cetera, et cetera. But at the moment, the way they're using coal-fired power plants is wildly inefficient. And so there's a lot of pushing domestically to address that. They also have got to deal with that to be able to deal with their air quality problems, because pollution abatement equipment does not work very well on 50% operating systems, right? They're not hot enough for the NOx reduction. So I think let's see what happens in the, I'm interested to see what happens in the 5-year plan that comes out in March. They announced pretty ambitious sort of general targets in the party plan, but the party plan is never specific enough for me to find anything worth
where it could be. Could you also speak briefly to, I recognize we have 8 minutes left and I want to give you 2 minutes at the end to give your big thoughts, but to the investment in the Belt and Road Initiative. And then there was another conversation, another question from Leah Liu, who's asking about, you know, if Biden's climate plan has called for China to end its financing of coal-fired plants, does the U.S. plan to help these countries by providing alternative financing or aid these countries to satisfy their energy needs? I think this larger question of international development and China's role in financing that and the West's role in not providing financing is the bigger issue here that I know you're going to address very well.
So in there, I want to give a shout out to our friends, Dr. Yang Fuqiang and Alvin Lin at NRDC, who've been working on the Belt and Road Initiative issues for a long time, and I think in the most constructive way possible, which is to engage with recipient countries. That you're not going to actually change this by demanding that the Chinese cut off supply of something that there's huge demand for, unless you also try to address the demand side. And so they've been working in Pakistan and Indonesia to try to work with local organizations to try to create demand for cleaner energy, right? And I think that this assumption that you can just say to the Chinese, you shouldn't sell this stuff, even though plenty of other companies around the world, from Japan, Korea, whatever, are selling it too, is unlikely to work as effectively as working with recipient countries to get them to think about alternatives. And I do think that providing good financing for alternatives is a great way to go. And, you know, the Exim Bank became very unpopular among right-wing Republicans at some point because they viewed it as like a subsidy or something. But the Exim Bank is very effective at helping businesses that are producing competitive product just have a decent financing model for developing countries. And so I think these financing models, we could do a lot to improve them in a way that would help promote clean energy and would be really beneficial for global pollution and climate mitigation, because a lot of developing countries have as big air pollution problems, especially in their capital cities, as the Chinese have in places like Beijing. So I think there's huge opportunities there, and we would be you know, it would be a good idea for us to think about our domestic capacities to do something really good that was helpful to business and helpful to countries that could really use cleaner alternatives. That's for sure. I totally agree with that. I also think that working with these recipient countries on what kind of realistic standards and incentives they want to have to promote it, that there's a lot more work in those areas that we could do a lot more on. And I would be hopeful that a Biden USAID would be thinking about those issues.
Well, and I think just recognizing that it's that 4 billion people on the planet whose demand for energy is increasing that will be driving the future of climate change. Our countries with too much need to bring down emissions, but that's where more energy is needed. So I appreciate that. I want to let you wrap up. What should we be thinking about? What should we be watching for? I've really welcomed this international contextualization of thinking about climate, thinking about China, and thinking about US-China relations in very different ways going forward. Please. And then
So,
the last minute, I'll be sharing future events.
okay, so my wrap up may be a tangent instead. So I did want to raise India for a minute. I mean, it's worth noting that the Indians have actually canceled a whole bunch of coal-fired power plants, including ones that they were going to order from China. And part of the reason for canceling or for the sort of cooling of interest in Chinese coal-fired power plants is that the Chinese plants are built in a context with a highly sophisticated coal supply chain where power plants can order coal of a very specific BTU and ash and everything else. And then the plant is primed exactly for that. And therefore, you can build it really cheaply because it doesn't need to be flexible. And so they look really great. So I also think one of the stories in the Belt and Road context is it's not clear to me how many other countries are going to discover that their Chinese coal-fired power plants are as great as they think they will be. So that is an interesting lesson to look at moving forward. But I do think that there's an opportunity if we can create some global standards to create global competition, and that will include things like the Indians really pushing their solar industry. And what we need to do is encourage all of that so that we get sort of the best solutions and the best opportunities for everyone. And if we can frame our efforts in an optimistic, forward-looking way where we're looking for winners and encouraging winners, I think we can all come out of this better.
You're sounding like a very positive Chinese focused solution set. Thank you so much. I have to say, coming into this week with all of the climate stuff going on, I feel trepidation and appreciating that it's people like you and the engagement and these big questions that will help to structure how we solve these problems in the future is absolutely critical. Debbie Seligsohn, Professor Debbie Seligsohn, thank you so much for being part of this conversation with us here in the New Energy series. And we really are thankful to have you share your expertise and perspectives with us. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this. Thank you for the super questions. It was great to see friends and others in the participant list, and hope you're all well and stay safe. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.